Again, Ben, thanks so much for taking the time to chat. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Ben Grossmann, and I was a visual effects supervisor for many years, virtual production supervisor, and now I run a little shop called Magnopus, and have gone from the full spectrum of visual effects into virtual reality.
Did you ever see that coming? I'm just kind of curious that we'd all be digging so deep into VR down the line.
Yeah. To be honest with you, I got snookered into visual effects in the first place, and I was super disappointed when I got into it that it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. And so basically just spent the whole career trying to get it to be real time anyways. And the virtual reality part of it, I don't know, it just seems like a natural extension of it. Or augmented reality, because when you work in visual effects, augmented reality just is like real time visual effects. So all these things kind of make sense, and they're just better interfaces for it. But it's not like I sat around and was like, oh yeah, I predict the future. It was more like the present sucks. Let's unsuck this. and then that's where you end up with, where we are headed today.
I love that. And yeah, I'll be sensitive to what you're saying is in headed, because yeah, I agree. I think that we're not quite where we will be soon, which I'm really excited about, but we'll get into that. Yeah. I am curious, just starting out, like, did you always imagine growing up that you'd be in some kind of creative career, or is it something that you fell into?
No, I grew up in Alaska in the middle of nowhere, generally speaking. I was in a military family for early childhood, but then when my dad got out of the military, we were in a small town in Alaska. So I grew up in the hunting and fishing and living off the land lifestyle. Electricity was a luxury. And so was indoor plumbing, quite frankly. Like, even when I went to college, I had no indoor plumbing. I was living in a cabin in the woods that had a drip stove heater. And we used to have to haul water in buckets and thaw it out when we needed to use any of it. So I worked construction, fishing, logging, stuff like that. Wow. I didn't really expect to get into a high-tech career or anything like that, or certainly not anything Hollywood or visual effects or fancy schmancy. So yeah, I kind of figured I would probably end up doing something like that. But when I went to the University of Alaska, I needed to pay for school somehow. And my mom had an old camera, so she loaned it to me to do whatever I could with it. So I started looking for a job I could get as a photographer. And so I shot weddings and, class portraits. And then I started getting into, I got a job at a newspaper. So I worked in photojournalism, and then I started working in page layout and editorial. And this is right around the transition of, we were making the newspaper in old traditional physical ways. I would go shoot film, I would process film, I would print prints, and then I would rush them into the layout so that people could, tape them all onto things and then reproduce them for sending off to the printing press at 2:00 in the morning. And then we just right around that time at the tail end of when I was a photographer, we started making the transition to digital. The Associated Press sent us a camera that was 640 by 480. And it was this giant suitcase. And it was like, test this out under Arctic conditions. And it was like, okay. So we'd carry this big thing around, shoot a picture and be like, damn, that looks cool, but it's only 640 by 480. So then I was sort of part of the digital transition there, started using Photoshop very early. And I thought that was cool. So then I got into video, news camera, started working for local news stations and going out and shooting video. Still analog, not digital video, but analog video, 3/4 deck, where I had to carry a suitcase on my shoulder that had a big ass deck in it. And then I, shoot 3/4, got into Beta SP, shot TV commercials, got into linear A/B roll editing and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of how I started getting into the film business, was through the traditional analog route. But I was still in Alaska. So I was like, nobody, nowhere. I was making TV commercials for $300 each. So I'd do a 30-second commercial. I would do the graphics. I would shoot the camera. I would do the editing. I would do the voiceover. I would write the script. I'd put the Photoshop logo on the end. And for $300, that TV commercial would air that night on Fox or CBS in Alaska.
Wow. So was that 2015 and it just turned out that you thought like analog editing and everything else was dated, but it turns out that it was just Alaska was, 30 years behind the rest of the technology.
Yeah, it'd be nice if I was that young. That was probably that was 1995, 6, 7, 8. And then finally in 99, actually it was literally 2000, winter of 2000. I was like, it's too cold. My car broke down. I had a car that there was no service or repair for in the state. So I had to repair my own vehicles all the time. And I knew the part that went out. And I was like, I'm going to have to order this from, Southeastern US. It's going to take 3 weeks to get here. I was super pissed. So I was like, that's it. Threw all my shit in the trunk of the car. And I was like, it's like 52 degrees below zero. I'm throwing everything in the trunk of the car. I got the car push started so that it was running. And then I drove straight to San Francisco without turning the car off.
I'm always fascinated by everyone's story because it's always quite different. I had a buddy of mine, you might know Matt Conway, who's a matte painter, and he came from Alaska. Yeah. Super talented guy.
I think he's from
Juneau, Alaska. That's the only reason why I know a city in Alaska is because he's from Juneau. So I know Brooke quite well, your sister. So
nice. Well, if you know the Ledoux boys are all from Kodiak. And actually, Chris Ledoux worked at the TV station I used to work at in Fairbanks, Alaska. So I met Chris Ledoux before he came down and got into visual effects. And I think actually I hired both of Tim and Chris. Mm-hmm. Chris from Fairbanks, Alaska, to work at the orphanage in San Francisco with me. And then Tim, after he graduated in Santa Barbara at Syndicate in Santa Monica. So they run Crafty Apes.
Got it.
Now, which is a pretty big visual effects company. Those guys are doing really well. There are some hidden Alaskans throughout here. There's a bunch of crazy people up there that got nothing better to do than muck around.
It's kind of awesome though. And I'm kind of curious though, for you to literally hop in your car and drive to Northern California, what's that transition like?
It starts out really cold and then it gets progressively hotter and more crowded.
That's
so
right.
I left and it was dark because it was in the winter. So it's like dark all the time, sun never comes up, and it was cold as hell. And then I just drove in the course of 2 or 3 days where I never turned the car off. I just kept it running and kept going. By the time I got to San Francisco, it was like sunny and dry, and there was tons of people everywhere. The transition was surprising, I think, because I felt like, in Alaska, there's no rules. There's no school that tells you like, well, if you want to get into this industry, this is what you have to do. And I was also kind of in the early days of the internet. So it wasn't like you could just be like, oh, I'm going to watch a bunch of YouTube's videos about this. None of that existed. So I didn't really know any better is really what it comes down to. So my entire career was based on, I didn't know any better. And so somebody mentioned this to me the other day. There's a famous quote, the fool didn't know it couldn't be done, so he did it. And that was probably more along the lines of where I came from, which was, well, I got all this shit here. I might as well plug it in and see what it does. And usually it didn't come with a manual. So the transition for me was a little surprising in the sense that I got down to San Francisco wasn't really my jam. I had a hard time finding parking. So I kept going to Los Angeles until I could find a place to park. And then I ended up sleeping on a bunch of couches and bumming around town trying to see if I could find a job for the first year or so. And I couldn't get a job because no one really cared what I had done before. In Hollywood, it's like you're either in Hollywood or you're not in Hollywood. That's right. At the time, it's different now because that was at the time when Hollywood was where you made movies. Vancouver wasn't really a thing yet. London was barely a thing. This was early days of Hollywood is Hollywood. That's where you go if you want to make movies. And because I had no track record in Hollywood, everyone was like, listen, kid, you're about to get a whole bunch of nothing. And so nobody cares what you did in Alaska. And so I couldn't get a job as an editor or a cameraman or anything. I was trying anything I could possibly get because I didn't even know about visual effects at the time. And I was working as a receptionist, temp office worker, filing paperwork. And then one day I was working as a receptionist and somebody came up to me and said, I used to fix people's computers too. I'd be like, whatever you got, whatever problem you have. And I knew how to make web pages and I knew how to, burn CD-ROMs and all that kind of shit. So this one woman was like, you're handy with the computers. Maybe you'd be interested in visual effects. And I was like, well, I don't really know much about visual effects. And she said, nobody knows anything about visual effects. That's kind of the point of it. It's a black box. It's a mystery. And you just throw things in there and miracles come out, but it's crazy. So maybe you'd be into it. And so I said, well, I have no idea how to get into it. And they said, well, it's non-union. So I had told her, I was like, I can't get a job in this town because they're all union jobs and I can't even get into the union. So I can't do anything. And she said, well, visual effects is non-union. So maybe you got a chance there. I'll introduce you to somebody who is an agent for visual effects artists. And I got to go meet him and ask him, if there was anything he could do to help me. And he said, hell no, you got no, you got no resume, you got no track record. I mean, you did stuff in Alaska. You seem like a nice kid, but nobody in Hollywood cares about any of that. And so he's like, this could be kind of tough. But he's like, look, I like what you did with your resume and your DVD and your website and all that kind of stuff. It all looks very nice. Like, I'll hire you to do that stuff for my clients. So I ended up as a front office worker for visual effects artists and visual effects supervisors, formatting their resumes and helping compress their demo reels and do all that kind of stuff. And the deal was, eventually, if an opportunity arose that he didn't have a client for, then he'd send me out. So eventually one day I got a job in Roto Paint. And it was an entry-level position. He had nobody to do it. And it was, Roto Paint. It's just brute force manual labor. And so I started in Roto Paint.
What year was
That's
this?
how I got into visual effects. About 2001.
Okay. So probably when you talk about agents, was that Bob Coleman, or were there more agents back then? Okay.
No,
good old Bob.
That's pretty much Bob Coleman.
That's great. And what software were we using for editing and painting? And please don't say the obvious of edit and paint.
The stuff that I liked the most, quite frankly, because I thought it was, and to this day, I still think it's the best tool for the job, is Commotion 2.1. Puffin Design's Commotion 2.1 was like
they had a really amazing tracker that stood out compared to every other tracker back then.
The tracker was phenomenal, but also the super clone tool, to this day, I have never seen anyone make a super clone tool as good as that. And Nuke and everybody else and Shake and everybody were always like, oh yeah, we've replaced the super clone tool. I'm like, no, you haven't. To this day, the super clone tool was better in Puffin Designs 2.1. And actually, Puffin Commotion screwed it up in 3 point whatever and totally rewrote it and changed it. And I was like, it used to work and now it doesn't. Anyway, that was the only way I started. I started on Hong Kong Kung Fu movies. And the first major mainstream Western movie that I got to work on was Spider-Man, the very first Spider-Man. Yeah, did wire and paint removal. It was funny.
That's great. And again, that's such a great iconic film to start out on as well. I'm always fascinated by that. Like, both, you're not the only person. I mean, even just a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned I was chatting with Tim Miller. I was asking him about him starting Blur. And I think the reoccurring theme is always that if I knew how much work it was to do it, I probably wouldn't have done it. But the naivete of going in and then it's sink or swim, I think is always like the reoccurring theme. I'm just kind of curious, like you moving to another city and hustling, getting work and kind of working your way up, like what kind of mindset did you have to do that? Because I've seen people successfully do it. And I've seen some people not really have any strategy and just kind of assume that I showed up, everyone like drop everything and, make me successful. So for you, like what was that whole transition like and what was the mindset behind it?
It's funny to think about it because now you talk about these stories and people like forget the context. You got to remember what Los Angeles was like at the time. There was no smartphones. There wasn't a whole lot of internet. And if you wanted to, so we used to get around Los Angeles with a map book that everybody had called the Thomas Guide. And so getting from point A to point B was a complicated endeavor. Now you just get in your car and the car drives you to the place you're trying to go. You just say, hey, Siri, take me to wherever, whatever the hell. At the time, just going to interviews was like this, okay, I got a plan. Now I'm going to take this route to that route. You write it all down on a piece of paper because you just couldn't navigate your way across town and meet people. I know this seems stupid, but expand this out to how you got interviews and how you got jobs. And now you think like, oh, well, there are websites and your resume gets thing. And then there's a process and you get interviewed. That wasn't the case at the time. You kind of had to network your way into the business by meeting people and trying to convince them to let you do stuff. And there weren't like blogs and podcasts about visual effects and what people were doing. So everything was kind of secretive. It was like word of mouth, there wasn't a newspaper you could read about this stuff. It was just kind of like, well, I talked to this person. They said at that place they were doing this thing and they got this software that does that stuff. And so just learning about the industry was really a lot of mystery. And very rarely did visual effects break into the mainstream where you could read about it, except in something like CineFX, which was kind of like a Bible at the time. I was a little spoiled, I will say, because I came from a place where if your car broke down, there was a reasonable chance you were going to die. And so in Los Angeles, it's less likely that when your car breaks down, you're going to die. So for me, everything was pretty comfortable. I was pretty chill because it was pretty hard to get killed. And I was more used to bears and freezing to death. So I was pretty chill about these things. But but really what for me it was I saw a movie called Wag the Dog. And I went to school for political science. I didn't go to school for computers, or I failed algebra 3 or 4 times. And then finally they were just like, I don't know what to do with you. So I never really was great at computers from a coding standpoint. But I saw Wag the Dog, and then there's a scene in the movie Wag the Dog where visual effects just happen like magic in real time. And so I thought, cool, that's what visual effects is. There's the green screen, here's the person. They just say, oh, give me this, give me that. And it just happens. And I thought, okay, that's how visual effects work. So I want to work there. I want to get into that thing. And so somebody's like, oh, well, what you're describing sounds to me like a flame suite. And I was like, okay, cool. So after I roto painted and did all my work in roto and all that kind of stuff, I was like, I'm going to work my way into a flame suite. And then one day I finally worked my way into being an apprentice in a flame suite. And I was like, this is all a lie. None of this is real. These computer graphics look like ass, and they take forever, and that thing runs slow as hell. And
you don't like action? Like, what are you talking about? Come on.
I just started to realize that it was all smoke and mirrors, and that visual effects didn't really run that way. And it was actually a lot of like real slow manual work and all this kind of stuff. And so I don't know, the transition was hard. I was spoiled again because of Bob Coleman. Bob Coleman knew everybody and could make all those connections, because you couldn't do it yourself on the internet at the time. It was really a relationships business, and now it's become a little bit more commoditized, where there's stuff on the internet and you can contact people and hire them and put them to work. And it didn't used to be quite that much. And that was back when doing 200 visual effect shots in a movie was like a significant accomplishment. Did you see this one? They did 400 visual effect shots. I'm like, now an episode of Flash has 400 visual effect shots. That's if
I think it was Frighteners when that came out. It was like 98 or something that had 500 VFX shots. And then obviously Phantom Menace like hit the 1000. But before that, 250 would be like a big Hollywood AAA film.
Yeah. So the way that I got around really was a little unusual, because a lot of people, like, once they got their careers or they went to film school or cinematography school, they're very focused on like, I want to, you got to choose the right thing. You got to work with the right people. You have to say the right things at the right time. Otherwise your career's over. There was always this idea that you were going to get run out of Hollywood, and, oh man, you failed to deliver, you're out, kid. And so there was this pressure to like perform. And so the environment was crazy. Just to put this into context, I might make $600 a week, $600 a week. And a week was a week, 7 days, as many hours as you could be awake. That wasn't like a maybe. That was like no, that's how it works. Now, some places they give you Sunday off, but if you were expected to work, if you got that job, it was a flat weekly rate, and it was 7 days. And if the project needed 7 days, it was 7 days. And if it didn't, then it was 6 days by default, and it was 12 hours a day by default. It wasn't 8. And now that was because that was before you had like time and a half and all that kind of stuff. So there were like rumors of union shops, 1 or 2 of them, where they'd give you time and a half when you got to like, magic time or whatever. But this was an industry where I remember getting promoted from $600 a week to $800 a week, and being really happy about it, but still having to work 12 hours a day. There would be sometimes you'd go to work and you'd work. Sometimes you go to work and you wouldn't come home for 2 or 3 days, sleep under your desk, and everybody now is just like, that's toxic and that's evil. And it's like, yeah, but at the time it's funny. We didn't really all notice it very much. We just kind of were like, well, it's what you got to do to get the thing out. And it's the way the industry worked at the time. And it was normalized. It's not like that anymore, obviously. But Bob and I kind of decided, hey, since I don't really have anything invested in this, I didn't go to college for this or anything, why don't you just put me in all the most complicated situations, because I like figuring things out. It's not that I'm like a purist about art or a purist about technology. I just like figuring out problems. So find problems that are really problematic, and I'll just go try to figure them out. And so that was pretty much my career path. Was, if it's really fucked up, that's where I want to be. And sometimes it would be nice if it's really fucked up and it's going to be a good movie. Not always. Sometimes I worked on really fucked up things that weren't, but generally speaking, that was the attraction for me. Was not, I want to work in the movie business, or I want to hang out with celebrities, or I want to be on the silver screen, or I want to see my name anywhere. It's like, no, I just like figuring complicated things out and thinking of clever solutions to problems that nobody would expect.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that most people don't realize is that visual effects is just problem solving. Like that's how I typically would tell producers when they're like, what kind of work do you like? And I'm like, I like putting out fires. So whenever shit is hit the fan, that's the kind of stuff that I like to be able to jump into, because if it's long form projects where it's like, we got 2 years for this film, it's just like, great, I'll come on the tail end of it when
right. Call me
you're
when it's
wishing you had
fucked
all the
up.
time back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so what you said is like, I think maybe relevant to guys like, you and us, or you and me, who are maybe a little older and remember when visual effects was more Wild West. There wasn't pipeline. There wasn't really good commercial tools, blah, 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 blah. Because at the time too, it's not like, there was a lot of commercial software for this stuff. People were hacking and repurposing, architectural and engineering tools that were more mainstream to apply to this. And there were very specific things, but a lot of in-house software. We hadn't made the transition to commoditized software yet. So when you say that visual effects is problem solving, yes, there is still a large chunk of the industry, but it's actually a minority of the industry now that is problem solving. The majority of the industry now is actually pretty assembly line. It's pretty factory manufacturing. And so at the beginning, there will be some problem stuff. But if you just go to the Academy reels and look at the stuff now, and you go like, all right, well, what's the majority of all this work coming through and hitting the television screens? You realize people have departmentalized factory mindsets in global institutions around the world, which again didn't happen when we started. There wasn't global anything. And now it's like, well, first the plate comes in and it gets processed through pipeline, and then it goes to match move, and then it goes to roto, and then it goes to, comp for pre-key. Then all those things get put into automated scripts. Then those things go to modeling, then surfacing, texturing, animation. There's like a whole flow for all this stuff, and there are departments and things come through. There's still a significant amount of problems to solve there. None of these things are automated and magical, but the problem solving that's happening is that it used to be that one shot was probably done by one person, maybe two. Two people on a shot was fancy, and it was always a compositor and a 3D artist. Now, 20 people touch a shot by default, unless it's like you're just adding a lens flare and a camera shake. By default, any plate that comes in is going to go through 20 people before it goes out. And so the problem space has become much more narrowed, and very rarely are people like, whoa, I don't know what we're going to do with this. What should we do? Should we build a model miniature for this thing? Should we do a matte painting over there? Should we, those days happened at the very beginning in a small, but when you look at the large volume of visual effects now, it's become relatively procedural and narrowly focused.
Do you miss those days of like, oh, we got to do some CG water? Like that's going to be a challenge. Let me have a couple of days to try to put together a good shader and figure out how we're going to approach it, versus now where it's just like, okay, like, this is going to be exactly 3.5 days and 2 days over here.
That's why I left the visual effects. Visual effects used to be like that. I mean, I worked on Day After Tomorrow and all those movies where it was just like, sometimes a movie would get greenlit and you had no idea how you were going to do it. People had to start doing R&D like crazy. There'd be like months and months and months of people put into figuring this stuff out. And we would sit in dailies and look at film outs of the film, just looping over and over because we couldn't stop on a frame and look at them. It was film. It would burn a hole in the screen. So we used to sit there and be like, shit, how are we going to do this? Like, let's build a water tank out back and go film some elements, and then we'll cut those elements out, we'll key them, we'll comp them, and then we'll do some CG here because it has to be interactive with the CG model. And then you had to do that. Now you just go like, so we're going to put water there, go talk to the water team. And even though I'm not trivializing how complex all that stuff is, look at all the problems that we have in visual effects right now. What haven't we solved?
Yeah, it's
digital humans.
It's tweaking, it's getting the extra 5%. It's not
digital
how
humans.
are we going to pull it
and
off?
How long have we not solved it? We basically solved everything except digital humans for about the last 10 years. There's not anything where you're just like, oh, goodness gracious, whatever shall we do? Except when it comes to digital humans, which we somehow continue to manage to struggle with. Although I think we're pretty much, if we wanted to be across the finish line, we could. The real thing that the only real challenge that we have left in visual effects is time and budget. And those are two problems that I just don't get motivated to solve. I did plenty of movies where time and budget was the thing that was the hurdle we needed to solve. And I like to say, I feel like I was really good at coming up with creative ways to be faster and cheaper. because I never worked at big facilities and fancy visual effects houses. So I was always the kind of, if you were working with me, it was because you didn't have the money to work with them. So that meant that we had to use duct tape and rubber bands because we weren't going to be able to afford, 100 render nodes or whatever it took. So yeah, I think time and budget is the thing. So that's kind of why I left visual effects. I was like, well, digital humans are cool, but I'm not obsessed with them. So I'm just going to get out because the problem space is gone here. And we need to let's actually start working on that problem of make it faster and make it cheaper. If we can make it faster and make it cheaper, set that aside for a second. What if we could have the freedom? And this is one of the things that there's three things. Usually when somebody does something radical, there's an internal problem they're trying to solve, there's an external problem they're trying to solve, and there's a philosophical problem they're trying to solve. So I'll give you an example. Internally, I was like, it's bullshit that I can't get home in time for dinner. Like, it's bullshit. Externally, it's bullshit that I'm asking these directors or these cinematographers or these, creatives to make logical decisions with their brain in emails and paperwork instead of emotional decisions with their heart based on reacting to creative input, right? That's bullshit. As a creative, that's what we do. And it's fucking stupid. I hate it when visual effects companies, which I respect, when visual effects companies go to a director and they're like, well, we need you to sign off on animation and we need you to sign off on match move and we need you to sign off on models and we need you to sign off. It's like, okay, but you're asking the wrong part of the director's brain. When you say, I got a checklist of things you need to do, you're turning on the part of the brain that is very logical. I don't want a director making decisions with the logical part of their brain. I want a director making decisions with the emotional part of the brain. A logical director making a logical movie makes a shitty movie nobody wants to watch. An emotional director with a creative brain is making stuff that's like, whoa, I've never seen that before. This is exciting. Or I feel this movie. I'm connecting with this environment. It's terrible the way visual effects treats creative people by forcing them to be logical. It's just wrong part of the brain, wrong part of the psychology. So that's the external problem. And then the philosophical problem is just, there's a better way to do this. So why are we doing this wrong? And there are many other philosophical problems, I think, that could be addressed, but they're not the most important ones to talk about. So in those categories there, I said, well, there's no way to, visual effects now is like investing everyone's time into improving the visual quality and fidelity of the picture in ways that the audience doesn't appreciate or care about. That is 10 years ago where we got. 10 years ago, we got to the point where we're all just sitting around, enjoying the smell of our own farts in champagne glasses because the audience can't tell the difference between anything we're doing anymore. And in general. And when people go, well, that's not true. Look at all these shitty visual effects. I'm like, yeah, but those shitty visual effects are because somebody went in and tried to do something they had only half the budget for. None of those visual effects were actually hard. They were hard to do at the price point those people did them. So that was stupidity. That wasn't technology or creativity. That was just stupidity. You had to kind of get out of the visual effects business because everybody was so myopically focused on improve quality, tweak this. And then, look, I worked on 3D movies and I worked on what I would like to think are some of the better 3D movies that ever came out. And I know what went into them and what work it took to do. But I think that the Hollywood factory was starting to create content that wasn't really what the audience wanted because the Hollywood machine needed somewhere to go, It's like, shit, we need to progress somehow. Increase resolution, increase dynamic range, increase depth, add stereo, wrap the screens around the audience. I was like, you guys are desperate. Here's the fact. It used to be that people went to the movies on average 40 times a year. And now it's less than 2. So you're desperately trying to cling on to something that people are not necessarily attracted to anymore. And even though the box office grows because the market grows, because there's more theaters, because there's more countries, because there's more people, the number of theaters that people go to per year is not getting bigger. So if that's the case, then, and I understand why the theater industry is so desperate to try and come up with new innovations that compel people to have to go to the movie theater. But from a storytelling standpoint, from a creative standpoint, let go of that for a second. That's business. And just think, if you want to give somebody a great experience, why don't you give them what they want, where they want it? And trying to force them into some unique proprietary special over there is like, I don't know. I had a kid, and my kid started playing with an iPad. It's a real simple experiment. Give a kid an iPad or give a kid a television, and then give them the choice between the two. And you basically can answer your own questions right there. Film and television, no. Interactivity, yes. And so the funny thing is that when you look at what those kids do, and even as they get older and older and older, we're sitting here with like our microscopes out, you know, trying to make sure that there isn't a single pixel of dust in the corner of a frame at 4K in the freaking pad off the edge in the top right corner. And kids are like giggling and laughing and having a ton of fun through greasy fingerprint smeared iPad sneeze pattern on the screen. Like there's some tapioca pudding on the corner, and they're having a blast, you know? And then you look at the amount of time. It's like, okay, I'll watch this for an hour at best, or I'll play 6 hours of Minecraft. I'm not saying it's all about games per se, but it's that interactivity and that immersion and that agency that you give people. And you find that it's a lot more sticky and it's a lot more engaging. And suddenly I came to a sort of a realization that seems stupid now, which is visual fidelity is not nearly as important as interactivity. Mm-hmm. When all you have in a movie theater, because your hands are cuffed in your lap eating popcorn and all you can do is watch the big screen, then sure, visual fidelity is, you have to lean into that because it's what justifies people going into the theater because they can't get that at home. So you have to differentiate yourself. But as creatives and as storytellers, why is that theater thing so important to us? When if you just think about the audience, you're like, well, what's important to them? And then you realize, there are other things that they value higher than visual fidelity and high dynamic range, all kinds of stuff. People are going to argue with me and say they're going to be purists and, oh my God, you can't replace the theatrical experience. No, just like you can't replace opera. It'll continue to exist. And so will theater, and so will Broadway. But it is not the be-all, end-all content-consuming experience that necessarily is what the masses want when it comes to experience.
And I mean, all of that I think is really fascinating, but even the differentiation between, let's say, a Broadway play or opera is that it's a different type of interaction, but in a way, you being there, you are interacting versus a screen, which is a print copy. It's a very different experience.
Yeah, exactly. So that's an interesting point too, that people always say, like, oh, you can't do the live experience and people around you. I'm like, really? Because every time I go to the movies, I'm really annoyed by that person texting on their phone and this person eating their popcorn too loud and those people talking about other shit. I'm not like part of the collective happiness in responding to the screen. That's a nostalgic impression that Hollywood puts on people, that somehow being part of the collective is great. Now, in a live performance, it's different. And there's a whole psychology behind live and why that is. In a live performance, anything can happen. Case in point, the Oscars. Will Smith walks up and pops Chris Rock in the face. That shit wasn't going to happen in the movie version of the Academy Awards. Oh. And if anything, one could say, hey, you know what? Will Smith just did us all a really big service at the expense of Chris Rock. And that is, the Academy Awards was starting to go in the direction that the rest of television has gone, which is in order to give the audience agency to pause and go get popcorn themselves in the kitchen or go to the bathroom and then come back and hit play, or, oh, I'll just watch the rest of this later. In order to give the audience agency, we've gone away from live. And the only thing we've traded is what's unpredictable outcomes. Sports is the only thing left, and to some extent political elections is the only thing left that is live, and everything else is not. And so the Academy Awards this time had started to move in this direction of going, okay, well, if everybody doesn't care about live anymore, then we're going to start pre-producing things so that we can fit this into the box that everybody wants it to be in. And so then Will Smith single-handedly slapped everyone in the face by saying, this is what happens when things are live. And I don't think he did this on purpose, but if he did, it was genius. But that's what happens in a live performance, and people get engaged by it because it's not pre-produced. You don't know how it's going to end, even though you're pretty sure you know how it's going to end. Anything can happen. The wire can break, the performer can fall, the scenic can tumble over, the music can stop working. You know, there could be a fire. And that anticipation and that drama is what makes live events so interesting. Cinema, you don't have that at all anymore. You know the outcome because it was already reviewed on the internet. You know how the movie ends. So
yeah, I love that. I mean, that's the psychology of how gambling works as well, is that it's unpredictable outcomes. If you were to pull the lever and every time get money, then you're gonna,
The
you know,
same
keep
amount of
going.
money.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
But
in
yeah.
gaming, it's called the law of variable rewards.
Okay.
There's if you read books on human perception and psychology, variable reward is
Mhm.
a psychological thing that humans still can't deal with, and we are just attracted to it. And so that's a variable outcome. If you always gave somebody 25 cents for pressing a button, then studies show this time and time again. They'll press the button until they get bored of 25 cents, and then eventually they press the button less, and then they're just like, I don't need any more quarters. But if every time they press the button, it's some coin between 25 cents and a penny, then people will press that button all day, every day, and they'll just keep doing it until they can find a pattern in the reward, and then they'll lose interest and move on, or until they get so wealthy from getting pennies that they can buy a yacht and sail off. But yeah, that is the essence of the difference between pre-produced and live. And now we're getting into this really cool shit with immersive. And it's not that I work in, that I'm so passionate about VR. I actually use VR relatively little, but we concentrate here at making experiences that are accessible, so that it used to be that people thought about getting media by going to a specific place and using a specific piece of technology. The medium became the message, right? I'm going to go see cinema. I'm going to go see opera. No one says I'm going to go see Hamlet, and it doesn't matter whether it's cinema or opera or theater or whatever. They just say, I'm going to go see the medium, right? So they focus
Mhm.
on that. I'm going to go play Xbox. I'm going to go play PlayStation. So we have grouped all of our experiences into the device that we use to access them. In my opinion, this concept of the metaverse is really about taking the focus away from the devices and putting it into a world that is a cloudy world of experience, and saying, here is a coherent, holistic, interconnected vision of a story or a place or a thing or a whatever. And you can access that and get a slightly different experience through different devices and different places with different people at different times, but it's still the world. And so when filmmakers say they're world builders, that's 99% bullshit. 99% bullshit. And I can tell you, because there are very few organizations who have actually succeeded in building a world, right? And that's the MCU and that's Star Wars. Nobody else. I don't want to hear about it. Nobody else. And even them, it's fragmented bullshit. And that. Like, go talk to anyone who's a hardcore Star Wars purist and be like, so what do you think about the Book of Boba Fett? What do you think about the new Obi-Wan Kenobi? And it's just like, I mean, they're using super glue and duct tape and band-aids to try and weld all this world together, because it's kind of a little unwieldy. The point is that you can build a world with this metaverse construct. You can give people different access points to it. Oh, you want to do this in VR because you have VR? Great. You want to do this in AR because you're in the physical world? Great. You want to do this on text messaging relationships with the characters in that world? There you go. You want to use a web page? The devices need to go away. Focus on the experience and the content. And we need to evolve as a society away from lumping all of our experience and categorizing it by technology, and just go towards experiences now move ubiquitously through all of these different mediums, much in the same way that people can enjoy seeing things, hearing things, feeling things. Let's get closer to human emotion that way, by abstracting away those really annoying devices that expire and limit things.
No, yeah, I love that. I think that's something to really think about a lot. Like you're mentioning books in psychology. Is there any go-tos that you'd recommend, like influence from Dr. Robert Cialdini or anything like that?
Yeah, it's actually it's funny you should mention that, because I've handed that book out like candy lately.
I have like 5 copies because I'm always gifting it. So yeah.
I have a box right there with 3 copies in it. I actually just recently discovered that book. I've been reading. I kind of like The Laws of Power, because it's like The Laws of Power by Robert Greene. It's a very dangerous book. You sometimes give that book to someone who's not prepared for it, and they turn into a completely evil asshole. And then you give that book to other people and they feel dirty reading it. It is but because what I went to school for when I was a kid was political theory and political science, I was a little bit more, emotionally contextualized to understand that sometimes in order to understand good, you must study evil. And if you stop feeling emotional responses to good and evil so that you can just understand them, then you can say, okay, now my compass should be good. But in order to understand it, had to learn evil. And a lot of people are afraid of that concept. And the laws of power tries to divorce everyone away from stop thinking about good and evil and just start thinking about how shit gets done. And that is effectively power. And I think it does a very good job. Very few people can actually make it through that book. And if you read it twice, then you're either going to be a real bad person or a real good person. And if you can't handle that one, there are a few other flavors of it by Robert Greene, but I think that one's the most sort of raw and clean and simple. But Influence, fantastic book. When you get into things like you read Chris Voss for hostage negotiation tactics, you start to learn some of the psychology. Actually. Oh yeah, fantastic. I mean, like I often have to use my late night FM DJ voice on people to get them to make the right decision. Although I'm not a huge fan of Malcolm Gladwell, I think Malcolm Gladwell should stop writing sooner. He does this really big volume of stuff, and really you should have condensed that down to about 1 or 2 chapters, and that was all anybody really needed, and the rest of it tended to be fluff. But he has really great, anecdotes and premises that just I think have too much wrapped around them. All of those I like the research and the psychology of perception. I think that's really important stuff. And communication, because ultimately at the end of the day, as a visual effects supervisor and as a virtual production supervisor, I'm not smart. I don't know I suck at doing a lot of these things. I mean, yes, I was an artist and I used to do matte paintings and I used to do compositing and I used to cinematography and all that crap. But it's not like I'm great or good. What I'm good at is translating between 2 people. And I tend to find a way to sit in the middle of somebody who's really creative and somebody who's really technical, somebody who's really logistical and somebody who's really emotional, somebody who's, really rich and somebody who's really poor. Like my job is to just translate so that people can find alignment and go towards a common purpose and actually achieve it. A lot of times the reason why things suck is because people just fail to communicate. The producer was serious when he said he didn't have any more money. You, like a fucking idiot, said, I'm just going to brute force my way into this thing. Well, if you knew it was going to take a lot of money to get there and you didn't believe the producer when they said that they weren't going to pay for it, then guess what you ended up with? You ended up with an aborted fetus of a movie. Who won now? Well, I can't compromise my vision. Then you shouldn't have started on that journey with that producer and that budget. That was your own stupidity. So everybody will then blame the producer. And it's like, nah, man, you should have known what you had to work with. It was failure to communicate. So generally speaking, it's like a misalignment of communication. And my job is really just to make sure everybody's on the same page. Everybody understands what problem we're trying to solve and everybody is aligned. And then, damn, we can go far, fast and do amazing things. But communication and persuasion and clarity of communication is hands down, I think, one of the most important things for anybody getting anywhere into any industry, whether you're communicating what your ideas are or whether you're listening to what other people are saying. That right there,
just listening,
it's critical.
It's funny you say all that. It's funny. Actually, to correct myself, I had Brandon Voss on, which is Chris's son, but they co-wrote.
No, yeah, Brandon does the training with his dad.
That's right,
at
Black
the company that
Swan
they have
Group.
too. Black Swan Group, yeah. So I like a lot of those master classes, and you know who else is good? Daniel Pink. Daniel Pink is good. Why? Yeah, Daniel Pink is a great communicator. He's a great communicator. He's humble about it, but he just kind of like, Chris Voss and like Robert Cialdini, or however you pronounce his last name. It has too many vowels for me. And you get, he just goes in there. He's like, hey, people complicate things. Simplify them. Here's what people can handle. Here's what studies show and research. And he backs it all up with real facts. I think Daniel Pink is really a good communicator.
Look him up because Gladwell, Robert Greene. Again, 48 Laws of Power is actually, this isn't the first time I've talked about the ethics of that book on the podcast. It's like, it was Hugo Martin, the director of Doom over at id Software. We're talking about that because he was saying the same thing. Like it's such an evil book in the wrong hands. So it's kind of fascinating to kind of see how polarizing it can be. It's funny you say communication though, because hands down, I think that's the most important skill set that anyone can learn, whether you naturally adopt it or whether you intentionally lean into it. But it's such an underrated thing because it's everything. It is the difference between being able to read a producer and ask the right questions to understand, okay, do you actually have more money or don't you? And I think Chris Voss actually talks a bit about that, or I've heard other conversations where it's kind of, if you are negotiating money, when they start negotiating other things, that's when it truly shows that they have no more money in the bank, but they do want to move forward. Yeah, it's so critical to be able to navigate anything, especially be able to work on set.
He says, how can I do that? Like one of the best things that I'm a terrible negotiator, right? And I have negotiated $50 million contracts before, and that's a horrifying process. Hundreds of lives on the line, people doing deadlines and crazy stuff. And, like you take a lot of responsibility when you're doing that, right? And I generally would think that I'm a terrible negotiator. All I'm doing is communicating and clearly what people need and what people want and trying to make those two things align. And what Chris Voss says is you just go, well, okay, I understand that you want this. Is that right? Yeah, that's what I want. Okay. Well, how can I do that? Here's what these things take. How do I? And then the responsibility transfers to them. Mm-hmm. And they're like, if they truly get down to well, I don't give a fuck how you do it. I'm just telling you that that's what you're going to do. Well, they better have a gun to your head, because in visual effects, this is so common a problem, is that we're optimistic and saying, well, the producer said they're not going to pay for it, but we have to do this. And I'm like, right, but can we do that? Because if we can't, then we might as well be upfront about it before we fail, because we're going to fail. So let's just get everybody lined up on this. The way Chris Voss puts it is very clear. But when you say, visual effects is problem solving, yes, but the problem that we're solving is bad communication. So we're solving bad communication in several different areas. We're solving bad communication between the people who are paying for the work to be done and the people who are doing the work. We're solving bad communication between the audience and the filmmaker. We're solving bad communication. Just always pick the opposing parties, and that's what visual effects is doing. Visual effects, what problem are we solving when we're like, oh, well, they went and shot all these plates, which were total fucking garbage, and now we have to replace all this shit with visual effects? Bad communication. Somebody shouldn't have shot all that stuff, or they shot it all optimistically believing that that's actually going to work in camera, but it wasn't. And sometimes it's just like, well, the director didn't really want to get into an argument with the DP, so we let the DP do whatever they wanted to do, and then blah, 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 blah. And now we're all here just making it what the director wanted, which is actually not even anymore what the director wanted. Now it's what the editor wanted or the producer needed. It's all communication. So
I love that, because 9 times out of 10, when projects are going awry, it's usually, there's several questions I would have asked at the beginning if I were around for that probably would have put us in a better space. And it's usually is not preempting the right questions to have the right conversation, even just making sure that the director actually knows what they want versus what they're saying, just by leaning in further.
So this is a very dangerous thing, but it's an important thing, and that is I very rarely give a director what they ask for, and they're not aware of that because they get what they want. What you have to focus on is what a director needs, what a director wants, not what a director tells you to do or says to do. You got to watch your ass, because sometimes a director like David Fincher knows exactly what he wants and needs and is telling you to do things in a language that he thinks you're going to understand to do it. But a lot of times people make a mistake, and they said the director very specifically said on frame 47, put a lens flare right there. And I'm like, a director doesn't understand why in God's green earth they should put a lens flare at frame 47 right there. There's another problem they're trying to solve that you're just not aware of. And the problem they're trying to solve is that your CG looks like ass on frame 47 over there. So they're trying to distract you by putting a lens flare over here. And you just can't think that far ahead because you're so literal that you're just like, but director said note on screen, so I address note. And then you're like, yeah, and the shot still looks like shit because the director was trying to help and couldn't even articulate why or what. But a lot of times, like it's an important part of filmmaking. And sometimes, like if I've worked for a difficult director, and I am maybe have worked for a lot of really, really difficult directors and visual effects supervisors, very difficult visual effects supervisors too. The secret was, it wasn't like, oh, I paid more attention in dailies to what they said. It was, I went and watched all their old movies. And then I struck up a great relationship with their assistant. And I asked, what movies are they watching now? Like, what's in their trailer right now? What magazines are they reading? What books have they read? And I get into the psychology of them. So, like, for example, Martin Scorsese. You want to know how to be successful in a Martin Scorsese movie? Connect with the people around him and get to know everything that is in Marty's head now. And then when you start designing shots like we did on Hugo, it was really simple. It was like, I would go look at the DVDs that were in Marty's trailer next to the television, and I'd be like, And then I would watch all those, and then I'd be like, And then I'd be like, oh, now I see what he's doing. He's like, he doesn't even realize what he's doing, but he's absorbing these materials, and he's like putting them back on the screen. So then you make a shot that looks like this movie that he just saw, and he goes, oh, I really love the way that's looking. No one said anything about make it look like this movie. It just felt familiar and correct to him because it's in the context of what he's doing. And so it's, again, just communication. So you can do that with any director. Like Tim Burton on Alice in Wonderland, communication was horrific. The worst ever. I have never in my life had a worse experience of communication. I don't blame anybody for it. It's just, it's the nature of giant corporate machine tells people to make things. The only way we could get shots finaled was read a biography of Tim Burton talking about all the things that he loves from childhood. Okay. Now go watch all those movies that Tim Burton talked about loving as a kid. Okay. Now make all these scenes look like those movies. Okay. Final, approved. Great. Next. It was like, that was the only way to get it done.
It's brilliant advice. Like, honestly, some of the best advice I've ever heard, because you're absolutely right. Directors, especially directors, typically, they are borrowing from previous experiences, previous things that they've appreciated. And more importantly, like, you're learning their style. There was one show I was helping out PsyOp, LA's PsyOp.
PsyOp's a genius company.
Yeah, they're
I don't
amazing.
know what the hell's going on over there, but shit that I see that comes out of there is just like, I'm humbled. I'm very rarely jealous, but like, I see shit from PsyOp and I'm just like, oh my God.
I've worked with LA and New York, and it's kind of interesting when you have UK studios or New York studios migrating to LA, because they still bring that kind of vibe to it. Like, that place I really like. I remember when they asked me when I finished freelancing in LA what my experience was like. I'm like, this is the weirdest studio I've ever worked for. And I explained, like, I never got one little bit of direction ever. I just basically, when we hit our deadline, it's like, thanks for coming in. It wasn't, I was basically went to the director, which was David. I'm forgetting his last name right now, but I was saying, running out of time, like, I'd love for you to give me some feedback on the shots. And it's just like, no, they're all finaled. And it's just like, that has never happened in my entire life, but it's an interesting place. But there was one experience where I had a effects artist who was afraid he's going to get let go the next day because none of his stuff was being approved. The supervisor hated his stuff, the client side soup. And he was asking for help one night. And that was one of those things of, like, looking at his work, I'm like, this work's really good. I don't see any problems with it. And then he mentions there was like 2 shots that had been approved, which he'd never mentioned before. And I'm like, oh, well, that changes everything. Let's look at those 2 shots. And then right away it's, okay, your effects are really frenetic. They're the star of the show. This is a car commercial. The car is the star. So the 2 shots that were approved are the 2 that the effects were in the background supporting the car, not trying to say, look at me. And a lot of the time it is about just trying to understand, like, what's going through the head of the other person, not what's on paper that you're trying to tick all the boxes. I created that effect. It did what you asked me to do. It's really either, like I said, asking the right questions or more active listening, trying to understand what it is that they like.
Yeah.
And historically, you can see it in their work. It's always like they don't like contrast. They like more tied down.
Yeah, Roland Emmerich wants it darker, bluer, and backlit. And he is so transparent about saying it. Like, Roland, there's a lot of directors who just come out and say, hey, here's my groove. Like, this is what I like. This is what I don't like. And then here's the thing that I notice all the time. Artists who are not successful, when I say not successful, they may be very successful, but they're in a pigeonholed little box now. They like keep doing the same thing. Their careers haven't progressed, whatever. They focus on themselves. And listen, you're familiar with The Man of 1,000 Faces or The Hero's Journey, this idea that all these great Hollywood stories fit this pattern.
Miller story brand is a good example.
Story brand, exactly. So I spent a bunch of time reading all those books and studying all that shit, which I, of course, strongly recommend. I actually put together a whole presentation for people at my company, which I've been meaning to do, and I haven't gotten around to it yet. But I did a whole presentation on all of these things combined. The number one rule of The Hero's Journey is that you are not the fucking hero.
That's right.
So shut the fuck up. And so many times I've gone into a screening room and I've been like, all right, let's bring forward the artist who's working on this thing. And they're like, well, I felt it should be like this. And so I did that and I did this. And they use the word I like 27 times. And I'm just like, who the fuck are you? Is this your movie? Like, why don't you go direct your own short film?
You're the guy.
Because what I wanted to hear was you're the guide. The director who's sitting right here has got a vision, and it's not even his goddamn vision. It's his interpretation of what the audience needs in the context of this story. That's his job or her job, is to interpret the audience's needs in the movie. And you keep talking about yourself and not the director. And so, you know, in the influence book or persuasion, influence, chapter 10 or 9 or whatever, it's the power of we. And so I always pull artists aside and I'm just like, hey, don't ever say I again. You say we. And as soon as you say we, then the person you're trying to sell bullshit to feels at least like they own some of the bullshit that you're trying to sell. You say I, and you better be a fucking genius, because you are trying to sell some shit that inherently conflicts with what the director wants. So stop saying I and stop thinking about I. You know, like there is only we. We are all here working together on this movie. So what I want to hear is I. What we want to hear is, well, I thought we needed this, so I took a stab at that, you know, and when you use I in the context of your interpretation of what we want, okay, now we're on the same page and we're sitting next to each other facing a common problem, as opposed to sitting opposite each other, becoming enemies. In the hero's journey, you're not the hero. The hero is the person you're talking to. You're the guide who is going to present the plan that is going to achieve success or avoid failure. And sometimes you can only avoid failure, but ideally you want to be achieving success. And the faster people can figure that out, then they can become the heroes of their own journey later. But when you're working for somebody else, you're not the hero, man. You're the guide at best.
You want to be Yoda in a lot of cases. You don't want to be Luke Skywalker.
No movie I've ever worked at, people be like, oh man, Ben, you did such a great job on this, that, or whatever. That wasn't my vision. That was just me taking everybody else's vision, gluing them all into one coherent picture, and then sending it out into the world. It was the ingredients that were being cooked with. All I did was bring them together. This is not like, you know, to be honest with you, left with a blank canvas, I don't know if I could create anything of interest. All I can do is unify a bunch of disparate opinions into something coherent that fits within a time and a budget. And an amount of resources that are available.
It's extremely humble. Ben, I want to respect your time, but I guess if I would just ask one more question, it would be more of a broad one, but just in terms of your whole career, is there any key advice that you've received or even just hypothesized yourself that has stuck with you over the years that you use every day?
I think our conversation has kind of brought up a bunch of things I hadn't even thought out that were pretty good, but here's one that I like as a general rule of thumb. And I learned this from working with Rob Legato. I don't know that Rob Legato intended to teach it, but it was definitely a lesson that you learned. I think it was because he learned it from working for people like, you know, Jim Cameron or Martin Scorsese or whatever. There is pretty much almost never a reason to say no. Now, that's a very dangerous statement. And so I need to make sure everybody understands me on it, because there will be a lot of people on Twitter who are like, you need to say yes. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of people on Twitter who rightfully will say, you know, when they ask you if you need to work, you know, 9 hours instead of 8, you say no. If they'll ask you if you need to work for $45 an hour instead of 50, you say no. Like, okay, that's a separate thing. You're saying no to yourself there. Like, that's really what you're doing. And that's okay. It's important for people to set limits for themselves. And I support that wholeheartedly, and I endorse it 100%. Always set limits for yourselves that are safe. That does not mean that you're allowed to be the president of the United States. Like, it does not mean that you're going to be successful and famous at your job. Set limits for yourself and your career, but accept that you can't have everything. Sometimes those limits that you set mean you are no longer eligible to win the Olympics or whatever it is. You know, there are choices you're going to make in life that are going to decide your outcomes, and those are your right. You can be happy doing whatever the fuck you want. So don't misinterpret what I'm about to say. Never in my entire career have I ever been in a situation where me saying no to someone was necessarily, okay, I take it back. One time this happened where I said, no, I'm actually just going to say hard no. And I think it was lazy. I think I could have done better. But generally, in any circumstance, there are a lot of people out there whose instinct is to say, no, you can't do that because of this. No, you can't do that because of that. No, we can't do that. That doesn't work. You can't. And so what they do is they throw out problems. And that's not why I hired you. I hired you to make problems invisible. I hired you to make problems go away. So if I say, I want this, or can we do that? The answer can always be yes, if we change what you're asking for into that. So even if you can't possibly do what's being asked to be done, like, well, Marty wants this. Okay, there's going to be a counter, and you can always find a way to respond with yes, if. You might even change the question that was asked, but that works great, because if a person comes in, they go, hey, can we make this whole thing purple? And you're like, yeah, but more of a lavender. And they're like, all right, lavender works. Why not pure purple? Oh, well, because we're out of purple pixels. Oh, okay, well, that's fine. I'll take lavender. It's a little bit of a blue and a little bit of a, yeah, sure, that works. So you can always say yes, even if it means changing the question that was asked. But the people who say no, there's an immediate emotional, visceral, primate response to the word no. And I have worked with some directors and some visual effects supervisors and creatives and producers who can't see clearly anymore once they hear the word no. And so I keep trying to tell people, I'm like, if you change your psychology from instinctively thinking of all the reasons you can't do something, you won't be saying why you can't do something. You'll actually spend more of your neurons figuring out how you can. And then you become a positive person instead of a negative person. And nobody in the fucking world wants to work for a negative person. They don't want to work with a negative person. They don't want to work for a negative person. They don't want negativity in their lives anywhere. So get negativity out of your mindset, even if it means changing the question that was asked. And so I would say that that's a thing that you can do. Find yourself trending towards a negative response and find a way to turn that into a positive. And if you're saying that negative response because you need to protect yourself, then that's fine. You can always step away from that job. No one is an indentured, obligated person to work in the film business or in the creative industry at all. You can always walk away. And that's the one time I said no. I had my credits and my team's credits stripped out of a film. It's the only time I've got an uncredited film. And that was working for Michael Mann. And I just one day I was like, actually, no, I'm going to put my foot down and say, yes, we'll continue working on this. We'll do another 100 versions of this dumb shit you're asking for, but you'll pay for it, because I won't keep working for free chasing this hallucination of a butterfly that's in your head. And the producers came back and said, well, he really loves working with you guys and really loves the work you're doing. And you could totally do the next movie and all stuff, but he just wants you to keep chasing, da, 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 da. And I was like, sure, if you pay for it. Otherwise, hard no. Yeah. And then they were like, oh man, I'm sorry, but Michael is now cutting your credits from the film. They used all of our stuff in the picture. That was all the final material and everything. But they cut everybody's credits on the entire crew that I represented on that
yes, work. If you respect us is really
it was yes if you pay for it, because like I can't keep asking people to pull all-nighters for free. So I guess I said yes, but I definitely at one point said no. And then that was the end of the line for that.
It's kind of one of those things that if someone says no, then that's not possible. It's like, well, what if it was possible? What would that look like? Because a lot of the times people do put themselves in front of themselves and prevent it from ever happening, instead of saying, well, if we did, we need to do it this way. And they're already realizing, holy shit, there actually is ways to do it. Just I'm locking myself into that's impossible.
From being the guy who sometimes is in the room at the top upstairs with all the like senior decision makers, and I'm just wallpaper there. I'm the guy who gets coffee for people. I don't have any power or anything, but I see the decisions that get made. And what they do is they systematically eliminate all the people who say no, because no one fucking wants to work with people who say no. It's stupid. It's like, hey, we're here to do amazing shit. I don't want a bunch of negativity in this process. So like you systematically just watch them go, that person's not great. That person's not. It's usually because that person's negative energy and they think that that's their superpower. Like I could tell people what they can and can't do. You're off. See you next. You know.
I love that. Again, this has been so great to chat, and yeah,
Oh
just
man,
it's been a
great
lot
to
of
catch up with
fun.
you too.
And where can people go to find out more about Magnopus, which we didn't get time to talk about?
The short version of it is that we left the movie business because we saw that storytelling was one directional and kind of sucks. It's like the storyteller and then the audience is just a hostage.
It's
And
not
if it's a
choose your
really
own
good
adventure.
story, yeah, well, it's not even choose your own adventure. It's beyond that. It's kind of like instead of putting the audience in that theater, we decided to put the audience inside the screen and then start empowering them to do more and then start empowering them to be a part of what happens. Like, and I almost think about it a little bit like Westworld, but minus all the killing and fucking, which is like, what happens if you just create this world with all these possibilities and put people in it and then don't try to direct the outcome all the time, but the ingredients include the audience. So instead of just the ingredients being like, well, we got this actor, and we got this environment, and we got this story, and we got this pressure, and we got these external contracts and internal motivations, but also include the audience and let them be a part of that and give them a safe space to play around. So at Magnopus, we were really experiencing with how do we put the audience inside the movie and how do we make the movie everywhere in the world and just break that theater apart and spread it out so that it's every part of your life everywhere. And then what if it's not a movie? Could it be educational instead of just entertaining? Could it be your job? Could it be how you discover the world and learn? You know, all those things. And so that's kind of what's been motivating everything we've been doing at Magnopus. And it's been a lot of R&D and experimentation in different directions. And sometimes people think we're a virtual production company, but you know, we've got like 170 people, probably 10 are virtual production. And it's because we see virtual production as a bridge between these worlds of really exciting stuff that filmmakers have been the sort of guardians of for a very long time. We see that virtual production as a bridge into compatible technologies and formats that audiences can consume and experience. And so generally speaking, that's the area that we work in, is connecting physical and digital, connecting content and technology, and trying to build bridges that allow things to become free and roam crazy and wild and empower imagination.
I love that. Again, Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. I really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.